There are some secrets that, once seen, a person can never unsee. And Rowan Hale was about to witness one of them. Warm steam curled up from the floor of black marble, carrying the scent of expensive sandalwood soap, the fragrance of a world she had never once been permitted to enter. Her hands, roughened by years of cleaning chemicals, trembled as she dipped the cloth into the water. The man sitting motionless in the wheelchair before her was believed to have lost all use of his body from the waist down. The entire city of Chicago believed it. They said August Kane had been gunned down on a rainy night 2 years ago, that the most powerful crime lord in the city was now only a shadow of himself, imprisoned in a chair with wheels. Rowan had believed it too, until this very moment, because the instant she touched the cloth to his shoulder, a shoulder covered in old tattoos and older scars, the man's hand shot upward, fast, precise, and far too strong for any crippled man, and locked around her wrist. "Don't scream," he said, his voice so low and deep that she felt it tremble inside her own chest. "The 2 men standing outside that door will hear you, and you do not want them to come in, Rowan." The cloth slipped from her numb fingers and sank into the water. Her heart pounded as if it might burst. He had just spoken her name. She had never told this man her name. 3 hours ago, she had known nothing of August Kane beyond the rumors whispered behind closed doors. She knew only one thing, the thing that had driven her to the doorstep of this cold lakeside mansion. The cleaning job here paid 5 times what she earned scrubbing office floors through the long nights. 5 times. Enough to pay for the dialysis that was slowly draining the life from her father. Enough to place Jonah, her 9-year-old brother, into the program he had waited nearly a full year to join. They had told her one thing only: come, work, and never ask questions. She had not asked, not even when the housekeeper, her face cold as stone, led her down the long, echoing corridors and told her that the master's personal caregiver had suddenly left. So today Rowan would take over those duties: bathing, dressing. You are not permitted to refuse, if you wish to keep this job. Only now did she understand that nothing in this house was an accident, that caregiver had not left on her own. Rowan had been pushed into this room, and the man gripping her wrist had arranged it all because he wanted to see her with his own eyes. "I know more about you than you think," August Kane said, his dark eyes locked onto hers, still and cold as the frozen lake beyond the window. "I know your father is dying. I know about your little brother. And I know about the child you lost 4 years ago." He paused, and what he said next turned the blood cold in her veins. "I also know that it was no accident." Rowan could no longer breathe. What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice breaking into pieces. The man released her wrist. He leaned back, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a servant, but as a chess piece that had just been set down in exactly the right square on a board she had not even known she was standing on. "I am saying," he answered, each word slow and clear, "that the people who sent you here did not hire you to clean floors. They placed something in your hands and told you to bring it close to me. You believe you came here to earn money to save your family. But the truth, Rowan, is that you were sent here to kill me. And the most frightening part, you don't even know it yourself." Beyond the glass, the lake stretched out in an endless sheet of silent, frozen white. In that moment, Rowan Hale could not yet know that this strange morning, this freshly uncovered lie, was the least shocking of all the things waiting for her ahead. Nor could she know that one day, not far off, she would run toward the most dangerous man in the city instead of running far away from him. Because sometimes, the most bitter truth is the very thing that saves us. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so we can walk together through more stories of courage, truth, and healing. 1 hour later, in the dark oak-paneled study in the east wing of the mansion, August Kane sat behind a broad desk, with no trace left of the crippled man the entire city still imagined him to be. Rowan stood a few steps away from him, her hands clenched tightly together, still stunned beyond words. The man poured 2 glasses of water, pushed one toward her, then began to speak in a calm, deep voice that made every word seem carved into the air. He said she wasn't the only one who had been deceived in this story, that she was only the final link in a chain that had been laid out long before she ever set foot here. The first name he spoke left Rowan frozen. Seth Vance, the former husband she hadn't seen in 4 years, the man she had believed had disappeared from her life forever. August said Seth had never truly left. He was working for the Drago family, the rival clan that controlled the hidden underside of Chicago's financial world. The people who had waited for 2 years to bring August down after believing they had left him crippled. And now, they had found a new path to reach him. That path was her. Rowan shook her head, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. She said that made no sense. That she had found this job through an online classified ad. That she had applied because she was desperate for money, not because of anyone else. August only looked at her, his eyes holding no pity at all, only a cold, piercing understanding. He asked her whether she had ever wondered why a simple cleaning job paid 5 times the normal rate, why that classified ad had appeared for only a few short hours in the middle of the night, then vanished. Why, out of hundreds of applicants, the person chosen had been her. Someone with no caregiving experience, who just happened to be the former wife of a man tied to the organization that wanted him dead. Each question fell like a stone rolling downward, and inside Rowan's mind, the pieces she had never bothered to examine began to fit together. The roommate who had urged her to apply that very night. The new phone they had handed her at the very first interview, saying it was the homeowner's rule. Perrine's questions that had seemed so casual, about her schedule, about where she would be working, all of it, she realized with a chill running down her spine, had never been accidental. August rose, walked around the desk, and placed a small metal object on the wooden surface, thin as a card. He said that within the next few days, Seth would try to meet her and give her something just like it. They would tell her it was only a device for copying data, that all she had to do was plug it into his computer, wait a few minutes, then pull it out. Simple, quick, clean, with no one getting hurt. But that was the second lie. The device didn't only copy, it also carried something else, something designed to activate when it stayed close enough to him for long enough. Something that would make his death look like the natural result of his old injuries. And the person holding that device in her hand, the person the cameras would record, the person who would bear every ounce of blame when it was all over, would be her. Rowan felt the room sway beneath her feet. She reached for the back of the chair, trying to keep her breathing from breaking apart. In her mind, one single question echoed, bitter enough to choke her. They had chosen her not because she had value, but precisely because she had nothing at all. A mother who had lost her child, a daughter whose father was dying, a sister carrying a helpless younger sibling on her shoulders, a woman so desperate she would do anything for money and would never dare ask why. She was the perfect pawn because, when everything collapsed, no one would stand up to defend her, and no one would believe she was innocent. She lifted her eyes to August, her eyes red-rimmed, but her voice had grown steadier. She asked him why he was telling her all of this, why he didn't simply throw her out the door and let her drown in her own trap. August was silent for a long while, his gaze flickering with something she couldn't read, something almost like consideration, or perhaps a decision that had only just taken shape. Then he said, softly but firmly, that it was because she and he, despite standing in 2 worlds so terribly far apart, had turned out to share the same enemy, and sometimes, a shared enemy was the beginning of the strangest alliances. The silence between them stretched for one more beat before August returned behind the desk, sat down, and folded his hands in front of him like a man arranging the final pieces on a chessboard. He said she was standing before 2 paths, and neither one was easy. The first path was that she could walk out that door right now, return to the cramped rented room where her roommate was waiting to report every move she made to Seth, and go on playing the innocent pawn until everything came to an end. But when it ended, he said, there would be no way out for her, because to the Drago family, a pawn that had completed its purpose was only something to be discarded, so it left no trace behind. The second path was harder, more dangerous, but it was the only path that could get her out of all this with herself still intact. He wanted her to keep playing exactly the role the Drago family had assigned to her, but this time under his guidance. She would pretend to cooperate with Seth, pretend their plan was moving smoothly, take the device from his hand, and report the things August himself wanted them to believe. She would be bait, but bait set by him, a decoy within a decoy, while both sides believed they were the ones holding her in their grasp. Rowan stood motionless, listening, and when he finished, a question escaped her before she could hold it back, asking what would happen if she refused. August looked at her with eyes that held no threat, but left no room for illusion either, then answered that he wouldn't force her, because a pawn that had been forced into position was a pawn that couldn't be trusted. But she should also understand that once she had stepped into this house, the door behind her had closed long ago, whether she wanted it to or not. She thought of her father's pale face every time he came home from dialysis, his trembling hands no longer strong enough to hold even a glass of water. And she thought of Jonah, her little brother with a world of his own that only he understood, the child who had waited nearly a year to be accepted into a program she could never afford. As if he could read the thoughts tearing through her heart, August went on in a lower voice, saying that if she agreed, then from this moment on, her father would be transferred to the best treatment center in the city. Every expense would no longer be a burden crushing her shoulders, and Jonah would have a place in the program he deserved, this very week, without waiting one more day. Rowan looked up sharply, and for the first time in the conversation, the suspicion in her eyes was mixed with something far more dangerous. Hope. She asked him why he was willing to do all of that for a stranger, for someone he could easily use and abandon the same way the Drago family had. August was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then at last he only said that there were debts in this world that weren't debts of money, and that he wasn't in the habit of using people without letting them know what they were stepping into, because that was the only line separating him from men like Drago. That answer didn't erase the fear in her heart, but it made her believe, if only for a moment, that the man before her wasn't entirely the devil the whole city whispered about. She stood there in the stillness of the room, with nothing left to hear but the pounding of her own heart, and she understood that no matter which path she chose, her old life had already ended. She thought of her father, of Jonah, of the child she had lost, whose death she was now beginning to suspect hadn't been as simple as she had once believed, and she knew she had no choice left except to keep moving forward. She drew in a deep breath, lifted her head, looked straight into those dark eyes, and in a voice that was soft but didn't tremble, she said she agreed. But she had one condition of her own, that no matter what happened, he had to always tell her the truth, because she had already lived too long inside other people's lies. Something very much like respect passed across August's face, and he nodded, only once, very slightly, as if he had just signed a pact they both knew would change their lives forever. Everything happened so quickly that Rowan could almost not believe her own eyes. Within a single day, August's promise had become real right in front of her. The next morning, a black car quietly took her father away from the cramped room where he had been lying, waiting for each dialysis appointment, and brought him to a treatment center she had only ever heard of in dreams she didn't dare give a name to. When she called to ask about him, the nurse on the other end of the line told her in a gentle voice that all of Walter's expenses had been paid in full, that she didn't need to worry about anything anymore, and for the first time in many months, Rowan had to sink down onto the hallway floor, her knees buckling under the sheer weight of relief as tears finally broke through. But what truly made her heart burst open came that afternoon, when she was allowed to stop by and see Jonah. The boy was sitting at a wooden table in the bright room of the new intervention program, a place that only a few days earlier she had thought her little brother would never have the chance to set foot in for as long as he lived. Jonah looked up when he heard her voice, and across that small face spread a radiant smile she hadn't seen in a very long time. He showed her the colorful wooden blocks he had just been given, arranging them into a long, neat row according to an order of his own that only he understood, then lifted his eyes to look at his sister, his gaze shining, as if he wanted to tell her that it was good here, that here people allowed him to be himself. Rowan knelt beside him, placed her hand on his soft hair, and in that moment she told herself that whatever price had to be paid, this smile was worth everything she might have to trade. But that happiness didn't last long. When night fell and she returned to the mansion by Lake Michigan, back to the spacious room that had been prepared for her in the West Wing, the feeling of being trapped came creeping back, taking over her heart piece by piece. The housekeeper named Marlowe escorted her upstairs with cold politeness, showed her the places she was allowed to enter, and the places where she absolutely mustn't step, told her that dinner would be brought up to her room, and that she shouldn't leave her assigned area after dark. Rowan understood that even though her bedroom door wasn't locked, she was still living inside a prison. A soft and silent prison so carefully made that a person could easily forget it was still a prison. That night, she lay on a bed softer than any bed she had ever rested on. But sleep kept slipping away from her in shallow, broken waves. She stared up at the dark ceiling and listened to the absolute stillness of the mansion, a stillness that didn't feel peaceful at all, but instead made her mind sharpen with even greater caution. She thought about her father lying safely somewhere in the city, thought about Jonah's smile, and then thought about the price she had agreed to pay for all of it. She wondered whether she was sleeping under the roof of a benefactor or an enemy, whether August Kane was truly protecting her or only keeping her close, the way someone kept a valuable pawn until the moment it was needed. Outside the window, Lake Michigan stretched through the darkness, cold and unmoving. And somewhere far away, Rowan heard the steady footsteps of the guards making their rounds through the night, reminding her that she was never truly alone and never truly free. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to rest for the days ahead, but deep inside, she already understood that the real storm hadn't even begun. The next morning, the housekeeper Marlowe came to knock on Rowan's door very early, informing her in an even voice that the master wanted her present in the large meeting room on the ground floor, not to do anything specific, but simply to stand there and play the proper role of a devoted caregiver beside her crippled employer. Rowan followed her down the carpeted stairs, her heart filled with confusion, and when the meeting room door opened, she immediately felt the heavy atmosphere pressing over the entire room. Around the long table of dark wood sat nearly a dozen men and one woman, all dressed with careful formality, all rising in silence when August was wheeled in, still wearing the appearance of a weak man who needed care. Rowan pushed his chair to the head of the table, then stepped back to stand behind him exactly as she had been instructed, and from that position, she quietly observed a world she had never even been able to imagine. The conversation in the room moved in a language of signals and veiled meanings that she only vaguely understood. Shipments, routes, and sums of money mentioned under roundabout names, but what drew her attention wasn't the content. It was the way August controlled everything. He almost didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need a single unnecessary gesture. One quiet sentence from him, and the entire room went instantly still. One glance drifting across the table, and the person speaking had to stop halfway through his words. His power didn't live in noise. It lived in silence. The kind of silence that made the large men seated around the table measure every word with caution. Then, at one moment, August placed both hands on the tabletop and said there was something that needed to be made clear before the meeting continued. His voice remained as gentle as before, but the whole room seemed to turn several degrees colder. He said that over the past several weeks, certain pieces of information that should have been kept private had leaked out, and because of that information, an innocent family, people who had nothing to do with the organization's work, had suffered serious consequences. He mentioned the name of a woman and her children, who had been forced to flee their home in the night because they had been threatened, simply because someone in this very room had sold their location to the Drago family in exchange for a little profit. As he said those words, his eyes slowly moved around the table, steady and calm, until they stopped on a man seated near the far end, a man whose face had been flushed red and was now turning paler by the second. The man stammered, trying to speak in his own defense, but August only raised one finger slightly, and at once the man fell silent, sweat beading across his forehead even though the room wasn't hot. August didn't shout, didn't slam his hand on the table, didn't use a single crude word. He only said that he had known everything for many days, that he had given the man enough time to confess, but the man had chosen silence, and that in their world, betrayal aimed at the innocent was the one thing he would never forgive. He gave a slight nod toward the two men standing at the door, and they stepped forward, quietly escorting the man out of the room without the need for another word. The man didn't resist, because he understood better than anyone that resistance was useless, and on his face as he was led away there wasn't physical pain, but the collapse of a man who had just lost everything: his position, his honor, and his place in the only world he had ever known. The door closed behind him, and August returned to the meeting as if he had merely handled an ordinary procedure, his voice still calm, as though nothing had happened at all. But Rowan, standing silently behind him, felt a chill run down her spine. She had just witnessed another side of this man, someone who could decide another person's fate with nothing more than a look, and she understood that the rumors about August Kane had never been exaggerated. But at the same time, deep inside her, a question she couldn't explain began to rise. Why would a man that ruthless become so furious when he spoke of an innocent family being harmed, as if behind that frozen shell, there was still something hidden that she couldn't yet reach? In the days that followed, Rowan gradually realized that inside that vast mansion, there was one pair of eyes that never stopped watching her. They belonged to Caleb Reed, August's young chief of security. He wasn't as large or menacing as the other guards, but there was a quiet sharpness in the way he observed everything that always made her uneasy. Every time she passed through a hallway, every time she picked up her phone, every time she paused too long in front of a door, She could feel Caleb's gaze clinging to her like a shadow. He didn't trust her, and he didn't bother hiding it. Once, he stopped her in the middle of the hallway and asked her directly who she really was, a chance caregiver or a snake the Drago family had released into the house. And if she thought she could fool the boss, she was badly mistaken, because as long as he was here, she would never have the chance to harm a single hair on August's head. Rowan didn't blame him, because deep inside, she understood that suspicion came from loyalty, and loyalty was one of the rare things she had learned to value after so many years living among traitors. The turning point came late one afternoon, when Caleb personally escorted her out to visit her father at the treatment center. On the way back, the car had to stop because of a traffic incident, and while Caleb stepped outside to speak with the driver, he accidentally left the car door unlocked and the keys still on the dashboard. It was the kind of opportunity anyone who wanted to run would seize at once. The street was crowded, people moving back and forth, and all she had to do was step out and blend into the crowd, and she could vanish from their sight in an instant. She could find a way to escape this dangerous world, escape the Drago family, escape August, escape all of it. Rowan sat still inside the car, her heart pounding, and for one moment, the thought of running truly flashed through her mind. But then she thought of her father lying in the treatment center because of August's promise, thought of Jonah safe and happy in the new program, and she understood that if she ran now, all of that would disappear in the blink of an eye. Her family would fall back into the abyss, and this time, there would be no one left to reach out and save them. She couldn't trade the safety of the people she loved for freedom for herself alone. So she stayed seated, both hands resting quietly on her lap. And when Caleb returned to the car, he froze when he realized the door was still open. The keys were still exactly where they had been, and she was still sitting there, without moving an inch. He looked at her for a long time, confusion flickering through his eyes before something entirely new appeared there. He asked her why she hadn't run when she had the chance, and Rowan answered with only one simple sentence: that running away was never freedom if it meant abandoning the people she loved, that she was too tired of always having to run from everything. Caleb said nothing more, but from that moment on, something in the way he looked at her changed. His cold suspicion gradually gave way to a different kind of caution, one mixed with respect. In the days that followed, he still watched her, but no longer as if watching an enemy. He watched her as if guarding someone who needed to be protected. Once, he quietly brought her a cup of hot coffee when he saw her awake late beside the window. Another time, he told her a little about himself, that he had followed August since he was very young, that the man had saved him from a life that would otherwise have ended in a dead end, and that he was willing to give up everything for that loyalty. Rowan listened, and for the first time since she had stepped into this house, she felt she had someone who wasn't exactly a friend, but wasn't an enemy anymore either, someone she was beginning to trust in a world where trust was the greatest luxury of all. One morning, August summoned Rowan to his study, and when she stepped inside, she was surprised to see that he wasn't sitting in his familiar wheelchair at all, but standing by the window, both hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the snow-covered lake. He turned back, invited her to sit, then placed a thin file on the desk. He said that while looking into her life, his people had traced one name she probably still remembered very clearly, a man named Gerald Voss, the man who had once been the manager at the cleaning company where she worked during the hardest years of her life. At the sound of that name, Rowan's face stiffened slightly, because the memories of him had never truly left her. Gerald was the one who had cheated her and the other cleaners out of their wages again and again, knowing full well that they were too poor, too frightened, and too desperate to dare speak up against him. He was the one who had once humiliated her right in the hallway of an office building, spitting cruel words about her lowly place in life in front of her coworkers, forcing her to bow her head and swallow her tears without being able to answer with a single word, because she needed that job to earn money for her father and her brother. August turned through the file, his voice calm as always, and said that Gerald Voss, as it turned out, had done far worse things than anything she had ever known. He had siphoned money from dozens of poor workers for years, had intimidated the most vulnerable people so they wouldn't dare report him, and had built a small empire on the sweat and tears of those who had no way to defend themselves. Rowan listened in silence, not understanding why August was telling her all of this, until he went on to say that he couldn't stand the kind of man who made a habit of crushing those weaker than himself, that to him it was the lowest form of cowardice in the world, and that he had decided Gerald would have to pay. Over the weeks that followed, Rowan watched August's power move in a quiet but unstoppable way. There wasn't a single threat, not one act of violence, only phone calls, connections, and financial pressure applied at exactly the right time and in exactly the right place. Gerald's lucrative contracts were canceled one after another. His partners suddenly turned their backs on him. Debts he thought had been buried were abruptly dragged into the light, and the authorities began looking closely at the wages he had stolen from his workers. In a short time, the man who had once believed he had the right to trample others lost everything he had built. His company closed, his reputation shattered, and the people who had once been afraid of him now lifted their heads and demanded back what belonged to them. But what stunned Rowan most came one afternoon, when Caleb brought into the mansion a man she couldn't recognize right away. Gerald Voss stood there, stripped of the arrogant bearing he had once carried, his face gaunt, his shoulders slumped, his hands twisting together in fear. He had been brought there to do one thing only: to stand before Rowan and apologize. His voice shook as he admitted what he had done, apologizing for the wages he had stolen, for the insults, for taking advantage of her desperation, and the desperation of so many others. Rowan stood still, and inside her rose a tangled storm of emotions she couldn't name. Both the satisfaction of justice finally arriving and a vague unease at the way that justice had been carried out. She didn't answer his apology. She only gave a slight nod, allowing him to leave, and when the door closed behind him, she turned to look at August. He was watching her with an unreadable gaze, and she asked him why he had done all of this for her. August was silent for a moment, then answered that there were people who spent their entire lives causing pain for others without ever having to face the consequences, and that sometimes, if one person with enough power was willing to stand on the side of the weak, the scales of this world could be pulled back by just a little. In that moment, Rowan realized that the man before her was far more complicated than she had ever believed. Someone who could be cold and ruthless, yet could also shield the small, forgotten lives the rest of the world had left behind. One weekend afternoon, when Jonah's program was taking a short break for a few days, Rowan asked for permission to bring her younger brother to visit the mansion, and perhaps for some reason even she couldn't guess. August agreed at once, without the slightest hesitation. When the car brought Jonah there, Rowan still couldn't help worrying, because the boy had always struggled to grow comfortable with unfamiliar places, new faces, and a vast, silent place like this mansion could easily overwhelm him. Jonah stepped inside cautiously, his bright eyes studying everything around him, his small hands lightly clutching the hem of his sister's shirt, and Rowan had already prepared herself for the moment he would withdraw into himself, the way he often did in front of strangers. But what happened next took her completely by surprise. August, the man the entire city spoke of with fear, didn't move toward the boy, didn't try to start a conversation, didn't hold out his hand demanding a handshake or a greeting the way other adults always did. Instead, he simply sat down quietly on the rug, spread across the middle of the large room, took out a complex wooden puzzle, and began slowly fitting the pieces together, without saying a single word and without looking toward Jonah, as if he were playing by himself and didn't care at all whether anyone joined him or not. Rowan stood near the door, watching in silence, and she noticed Jonah gradually let go of her shirt. The boy looked at those colorful blocks with curiosity. Then little by little, very slowly, he moved closer to the man sitting on the floor. August still didn't look up. He only kept patiently arranging one block after another, allowing the boy to decide his own distance for himself. And then, something Rowan had never once seen happen with any stranger took place. Jonah sat down beside him, picked up a smooth wooden piece, and instinctively found its perfect place in the pattern, guided by a silent logic of his own. August stopped his hand, observed the boy's precision. Then, instead of correcting him, he gently slid the next matching piece toward Jonah's hand, perfectly adapting his own movements to the boy's quiet rhythm. There wasn't a single word of pressure, not one question asking why he was arranging them that way, not one attempt to make the boy behave like other children. He simply entered Jonah's world with the patience of someone who understood that some souls needed to be received exactly as they were, not bent into a shape that fit the world's expectations. And then Jonah lifted his eyes to look at him, and across that small face spread a smile, the innocent, trusting smile the boy rarely gave to anyone except his sister. Standing by the door, Rowan felt her throat tighten and her eyes blur before she even realized it. She had grown far too used to people looking at her brother with irritation or distance. She had grown far too used to explaining, apologizing, and protecting him from the impatience of the world. And yet here, in this room, the most powerful and frightening man in the city, was sitting on the floor, gentle and patient, allowing a little boy to be himself without asking for anything in return. The tears rolling down her cheeks weren't from sadness, but from something far stronger than that. They came from being moved by a kindness she had never expected. A kindness hidden behind the frozen shell of a man she had once believed knew only power and cruelty. In that moment, she felt something inside her change, as though some wall within her had begun to crack. But when she quickly wiped away her tears and turned her head, she caught sight of the housekeeper Marlowe, standing at the end of the hallway, silently watching the entire scene with an unreadable look, a look touched by suspicion that Rowan couldn't understand at all, and the warmth in her heart suddenly rippled with a faint unease. In the days that followed, Rowan gradually learned how to live in two roles at once, a weary splitting of herself so exhausting that some nights she lay awake wondering which one was truly her. In front of the staff and the visitors who came and went through the mansion, she had to play the part of a devoted caregiver to a crippled employer, pushing August's wheelchair through the halls with gentle attentiveness, straightening the blanket over his knees, supporting him whenever necessary, all of it so natural that no one could possibly suspect anything. August patiently taught her every smallest detail of that performance, how to adjust his posture so he looked like a man drained of all strength, how to pretend he needed help even with the simplest things, because he said that one small mistake would be enough to bring the entire disguise crashing down, and once it collapsed, it wouldn't only be him in danger, but her as well. But the hardest role, the most painful one, wasn't the role of caregiver. It was the role of the Drago family's loyal pawn. Every few days, she had to call Perrine. The former roommate she now knew was one link in the trap woven around her, and she had to lie, had to act as though the plan was moving exactly as expected. She told Perrine that she was slowly earning August's trust, that he was becoming more and more dependent on her, that she had started gaining access to private areas of the house, every lie carefully measured according to what August had instructed. Perrine's voice on the other end of the line was always sweet and full of concern, asking about her health, about her life inside the mansion, and it was that smooth, false tenderness that made Rowan's heart ache, because she realized that the person she had once considered a friend, the person who had let her sleep on the sofa during the most desperate days of her life, had never truly been on her side at all. Living between two lines of fire like that, Rowan had to stay alert every second of every minute, had to calculate every word, and the pressure slowly wore her down until she was nearly hollow with exhaustion. She no longer knew whom to trust. She no longer knew where the truth lay inside a maze of overlapping lies, and sometimes she wondered whether she was slowly losing herself in this dangerous game. She clung to the only two things that still anchored her to reality: the image of her father gradually recovering in the treatment center, and Jonah's smile every time she came to visit, and she reminded herself that everything she was enduring was for the sake of protecting them. Then one evening, just after she had ended another call with Perrine and was sitting silently by the window, looking out at the black surface of the lake, the phone in her hand trembled softly with the arrival of a new message. She looked down at the screen, and her entire body suddenly went rigid. It was an unfamiliar number, but the words that appeared made her heart seem to stop, because she knew exactly who it was. The message was brief but cold, saying that it was time for them to meet, that she should come to the elevated train station downtown tomorrow afternoon alone, and that there were things about August Kane she needed to know before it was too late, things that would change everything. At the end of the message was only one name, a name she hadn't heard directly in 4 years, a name that now filled her with both fear and a slow-burning hatred: Seth. The next afternoon, Rowan went to the elevated train station downtown exactly as the message had instructed, her heart heavy, each step feeling as if it were being dragged across the cold metal stairs. August knew about the meeting, because she had told him as soon as she received the message, and he had told her to go, to listen to whatever Seth had to say, because that was part of the plan, even though she knew that somewhere in the moving crowd, his people were quietly watching her every move. The platform was swept by wind, the sound of iron wheels grinding against the tracks rolling back in waves, and amid the stream of hurried people, she recognized Seth, leaning against a pillar, his face still as handsome as it had been before, but now holding something cold she had never seen during the years when they had still been husband and wife. A faint smile touched his lips when he caught sight of her, a look she had once believed was sincere, but now only made her shiver. He said he was glad she had come, that he knew she had always been a smart woman, and then, without circling around for long, He began pouring into her ears the poison he had prepared in advance. He said she was living under the roof of a monster, that August Kane wasn't the benefactor she believed him to be, and that there was a terrible truth about the past he had hidden from her. His voice lowered, filled with false sympathy, as he said that the child they had lost 4 years ago hadn't died because of an accident, but because of August's hand. He told her that at that time, August had been in the middle of a war over territory, and he, Seth, had accidentally been caught in the middle of it, that the loss of her child had been a warning August sent to him, an act of revenge aimed at the people he loved. Every word from Seth was like a needle piercing her heart, because it struck the deepest wound, the greatest pain she had carried for 4 years, and she felt the ground beneath her feet begin to sway. She shook her head, trying to fight back, saying she didn't believe him, that he had always been a liar. But Seth only looked at her with a carefully staged sincerity in his eyes, and asked her why a man as powerful as August would suddenly care about a poor cleaning woman like her, why he would be willing to pay her father's medical bills and look after her younger brother, unless he was hiding some guilt and trying to buy her silence. That question planted a poisonous seed of doubt inside Rowan's heart, because she herself had wondered the same thing during long sleepless nights. He went on to say that he wasn't asking her to believe him right away, only to find out the truth for herself, and to do that, she needed to help him retrieve the data hidden inside August's private computer. As he spoke, he gently took her phone under the excuse of saving his new contact number, and in those few brief seconds, he managed to install a hidden application on it, something he said would automatically copy all data when she placed the phone near August's computer, simple and traceless. He handed the phone back to her as if nothing had happened, then said she didn't have much time left. He mentioned the charity gala August would be hosting at the mansion next weekend, the event where the city's entire upper world would be present, and said that it was the only chance, because while everyone's attention was fixed on the party, she would have the time she needed to finish the task unnoticed. He said that if she didn't act before that gala night ended, there would be no chance left, and both she and her family would have to suffer the consequences. After saying that, he stepped back and slipped into the crowd just as a train pulled in, leaving Rowan standing frozen on the windswept platform, her hand clenched around the phone that had now become a ticking bomb, her heart tangled between 2 versions of the truth, unable to know which was real and which was false. Rowan returned to the mansion when dusk had already begun to fall, and instead of going back to her own room as she usually did, she went straight to August's study, her heart like a banked fire waiting only for the smallest breath to flare. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and August lifted his eyes from the file on his desk, a flash of surprise passing through them at her sudden appearance. He asked how the meeting had gone, his voice still as calm as always, but Rowan didn't answer that question. Instead, she stood in the middle of the room, both hands clenched tight, and asked him directly whether he was the one who had caused the death of her child 4 years ago. The question hung in the air like a blade, and for a moment, the room sank into absolute silence. August's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened, and he set down his pen, slowly asking her who had told her that. Rowan answered that Seth had told her everything, that he said her child's death had been a warning August sent to him during the old war over territory. August rose to his feet, and for the first time since the day she had stepped into this house, she saw something dangerous flicker through his calm bearing. He said she was letting the words of a liar poison her mind, that Seth was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly where to touch her in order to hurt her most. But Rowan refused to back down. She asked again, then why? Why would a man like him suddenly care about her fate? Why would he pay her father's medical bills, arrange a program for her brother, if not because he was trying to hide something, trying to buy her silence with false kindness? Those words seemed to strike some place that made August go still, and he looked at her with an unreadable expression, then said that if she truly believed he was capable of doing something that cruel to a child who had never even had the chance to be born, then perhaps she had never truly understood what kind of man he was. Rowan gave a bitter laugh and answered that how could she possibly understand a man who had lived his whole life behind layers of masks, a man whose very disability was only a performance. How could she know which August was real, and which August was the one he had created to deceive the world? That sentence landed like a knife, and she saw his jaw tighten. He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping lower, but every word heavy with force, saying that he had promised her from the beginning that he would always tell her the truth, and that he had never once broken that promise. While the man now making her doubt him was the very man who had lied to her throughout their entire marriage. He asked her that between someone who had always been honest with her, no matter how bitter the truth was, and someone who had turned her entire life into a lie, who would she choose to believe? Rowan stood there trembling, because that question pushed her straight toward the abyss she feared most, the abyss of doubt, where she no longer knew what she could hold on to. She said she didn't know who to believe anymore, that she was so tired of being used by everyone, that she only wanted to know the truth once in her life. August looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes, the anger gradually gave way to something almost like pain. He said softly that she would have her truth sooner than she thought, but there were some truths that, once known, could never be walked back from, and he asked whether she was truly ready to face it. Rowan didn't answer, because deep inside, she wasn't sure she was ready at all. The silence between them stretched for a long time, until August turned away and walked toward the window, standing there as he looked out at the black surface of the lake. When he spoke again, his voice was entirely different, deeper, more distant, as if it were echoing back from some place buried far inside the past. He said that she wanted to know what kind of man he was, so he would tell her a story that very few people in this world had ever heard. 15 years ago, he said, he had been nothing more than a 19-year-old kid, with nothing in his hands except one little sister he loved more than his own life. Their parents had died early, and he had carried the burden of raising her alone, doing every kind of work he could just to put food on the table, to keep his sister in school, to keep the two of them from being swept away by the merciless streets of this city. Her name was Sophie, a 14-year-old girl with a smile that could brighten an entire dark room, and to him, she was the only good thing left in a world that held nothing but darkness. August's voice caught for a moment. Then he continued, saying that back then, he had made the mistake of borrowing money from people tied to the Drago family to pay for his sister's treatment when she fell ill, and he hadn't been able to repay it on time. To people like the Dragos, an unpaid debt was the perfect excuse to teach someone a lesson, to display power, to remind an entire neighborhood of the price of standing against them. One night, when he came home from work, everything was already too late. Drago's men had come looking for him, but he hadn't been home, and they had poured their fury onto the only person there. Sophie died that night, at 14 years old, because of a debt that should never have had anything to do with her, because of the weakness of an older brother who hadn't been strong enough to protect his little sister. August stopped, and Rowan saw his broad shoulders tremble slightly, a trembling she had never imagined she would witness in this man. He said that night, something inside him had died with his sister, and something else had been born. A vow that he would never allow himself to be weak again, that he would climb to the very top of the world that had taken Sophie from him, and that one day he would make the Drago family pay for what they had done. For 15 years, he had built an entire empire from nothing, step by step, brick by brick, not out of greed for power, but for one single purpose that had never faded in his heart. And that was also why, he said as he turned back to look at her, he could never endure watching the strong crush those weaker than themselves, why he had punished the manager who once oppressed her, why he had grown furious when an innocent family was harmed by the betrayal of one of his own men. Because every time he saw someone powerless being trampled, he saw Sophie's shadow, and he saw himself as he had been 15 years ago, helpless and broken. Rowan stood in silence, listening, and tears rolled down her cheeks before she even realized it, because now she understood. She understood that the man standing before her and she herself were not as different as she had once believed, that both of them had lost a small, beloved life they had cherished with all their hearts, that both of them carried a wound that would never heal, and that both of them, in different ways, were victims of the same cruel force. August looked at her and said softly that now she knew why he cared about her, not because he was hiding some guilt, but because when he looked into her eyes, he saw his own pain. In that moment, the final wall between the two of them broke apart, and for the first time, Rowan no longer saw a terrifying kingpin before her. She saw only a human being, wounded just as deeply as she was. The next morning, August summoned a woman Rowan had never met to his study, a woman named Della Frost, with neatly cropped hair and the cold, sharp eyes of someone used to working with secrets. August introduced her as his most trusted technical specialist, and said he had asked her to analyze Rowan's phone, along with the application Seth had secretly installed on it. Della placed a laptop on the desk, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, and she explained that the application was far more sophisticated than an ordinary data copying tool. that it had been designed to hunt for specific kinds of documents hidden inside August's system. But what made the entire room sink into a heavier silence wasn't the application itself. It was what Della found when she traced it back to its origin, a file encrypted under many layers that even Seth hadn't realized was hidden inside his own phone when he touched hers. Della spent almost the entire morning breaking through those layers of encryption, and when the final lines of data appeared on the screen, she lifted her eyes to August with an expression that sent a chill through Rowan. August stepped closer, skimmed the screen, then turned to look at Rowan for a long time, as if weighing whether he should let her see what was displayed there. At last, he gave a slight nod, and Della turned the screen toward her. It was an internal Drago family dossier, filed under a name Rowan would never be able to forget, a name that sounded gentle to the point of cruelty: Lullaby. Her hands trembled as she read the cold lines written there, lines that exposed a truth she had never dared imagine throughout 4 long years. The file recorded that 4 years earlier, the organization had identified a serious problem arising from one of its most loyal operatives, Seth Vance. He had been assigned to approach and marry her as part of a long-term plan aimed at the connections surrounding the rival family, a marriage staged from beginning to end, a cold arrangement she had never known anything about. But the problem had emerged when Seth, against every calculation, began developing real feelings for her. And when she became pregnant, he started to waver, started talking about leaving the organization to build a real life with her and the child who was about to be born. To the Drago family, a wavering operative was an unacceptable risk, a weak link that could threaten their entire network. And that unborn child, in these soulless pages, wasn't mentioned as a life, but only as a factor that needed to be removed in order to pull Seth back into the orbit of obedience. The organization had made a decision discussed and approved as coldly as someone signing a contract, that the threat had to be erased, that Seth's loyalty had to be restored at any cost. Rowan could not read any further. Her eyes blurred, and the whole world around her seemed to collapse. For 4 years, she had lived with an endless self-blame, had asked herself thousands of times whether she had done something wrong, whether it had been her fault that she couldn't keep her child, had gnawed away at herself with a torment no one could soothe. And now, the truth lay exposed before her eyes, so cold and so cruel that she could barely breathe, that the greatest loss of her life hadn't been an accident of fate, hadn't been her fault, but the result of a plot calculated down to every last detail by people who regarded human lives as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. August stood beside her, quietly placing one hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, he didn't say a single word, because he understood that there were no words in this world that could reach the very bottom of the pain she was carrying in that moment. That night, Rowan sat alone beside the window of her room, staring out at the black surface of the lake without truly seeing anything at all, because her mind was sinking inside a storm no words could ever describe. For 4 years, she had carried an invisible weight on her shoulders, a quiet belief that she was the one at fault, that if she had been more careful, stronger, if she had done something differently, then perhaps it would never have happened. She had allowed that self-blame to gnaw at her day after day, had allowed it to shape the way she saw herself, as a failed mother, as a woman who was not worthy. And now, when the truth had finally been exposed, that burden suddenly shattered. But what rose up in its place wasn't relief. It was something far more powerful, a burning fury so fierce that it made her whole body tremble. She thought of Seth, and every time she thought of him, a fresh wave of anger surged through her heart. He had known. All those years, he had known exactly what had truly happened, had known that his organization was the one responsible for the greatest loss of her life, and yet he had remained silent. Worse than that, he had come back to find her, looked straight into her eyes, and pinned that crime on another man, using the very pain he had helped create to manipulate her, to turn her into a weapon for his own scheme. That cruelty, that cold lie carried to its very end, made Rowan feel as though fire were running through her veins. But in the middle of that blazing rage, something inside her was also beginning to heal, in a strange and painful way, because for the first time in 4 years, she could tell herself that it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she had been a mother who had loved and protected her child with everything she had. She broke down crying. But this time, her tears were no longer tears of torment. They were tears of release, as if an invisible chain that had bound her for all those years had finally been unlocked. She cried for the tiny child she had never had the chance to hold in her arms, cried for the young mother crushed beneath guilt that she had once been, and cried for the long stretch of time she had spent living in the shadow of a lie. When the last of her tears had run dry, Rowan sat up straight, and in her eyes there was no longer weakness or confusion, but a resolve as clear and hard as ice. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew she didn't want to let this anger turn her into someone she no longer recognized. Didn't want hatred to lead her to become like the very people who had caused all this suffering. She didn't want blood. She didn't want revenge in the way of the brutal underworld where Seth and the Drago family lived. What she wanted was justice, true justice, where the truth would be brought into the light, where the guilty would have to face the consequences of what they had done before the law and before their own conscience. She wanted the whole world to know that her child wasn't a soulless number in a cold file, but a life that had once existed, had once been loved, and deserved to have justice reclaimed. The next morning, Rowan went to August with a calmness that surprised even him. She told him she was ready, that she was no longer a pawn in anyone's hands, and that she wanted to work with him to turn the game around and bring everyone behind the lullaby file into the light. August looked at her, and in his eyes there appeared something that was both admiration and deep understanding. Then he gave a slight nod, because he understood that the woman standing before him now was no longer the trembling caregiver who had once stepped into this house. Inside August's study, the counterattack gradually took shape through one tense hour after another. August spread a map of the old docks by the lake across the desk, the place he had chosen as the meeting point to lure Seth out, a deserted, open location where his people could control every entrance and exit without being detected. The core idea of the plan was very clear. Rowan would contact Seth, tell him she had completed the task, that she had obtained the data he needed, and suggest a meeting to hand it over. But the data she would bring wasn't real. Della had spent many long hours creating a highly sophisticated false dossier. Documents that appeared extremely valuable, but were actually planted with misleading information, designed to lead the Drago family into a trap they would never see coming, forcing them to expose themselves before the law. Meanwhile, Rowan's true mission during the meeting was something else. She would have to make Seth admit the truth about the lullaby file himself. Admit that he had known about the fate of their child all these years, and every word of that confession would be recorded as evidence. August placed a tiny recording device in her hand, so thin it was almost impossible to notice, and Della showed her how to hide it inside her clothing so no one could discover it. He told her that the most important thing was to stay calm, to guide the conversation naturally so Seth wouldn't become suspicious, to hold back the anger inside her and let him fall into the trap of his own arrogance. Caleb stood beside them, his face solemn, and he would be the one responsible for commanding the entire security team at the scene. He studied every corner of the dock area carefully, positioned his people in hidden places, and planned for every possible situation, because he understood that when facing people like the Drago family, nothing was certain, and everything could go wrong in an instant. He turned to Rowan, his eyes serious but carrying a sincere concern, and told her that no matter what happened, she didn't need to be afraid, because he would always be close by, and he wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Those words warmed Rowan's heart a little in the middle of that suffocating tension, because she knew Caleb was someone who always kept his word, one of the very few people in this world in whom she could place her full trust. August looked at her for a long time before the plan was finalized, then asked her one last time whether she was truly ready to face Seth, because once it began, there would be no turning back. Rowan nodded, and there wasn't a trace of hesitation left in her voice. She said she had been waiting for this moment for 4 years, without even knowing it, that she was ready to look straight into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her life and force him to speak the truth. The night before the meeting, the entire mansion sank into a strange stillness, the stillness of the moment before a storm, when everything seemed to hold its breath and wait. Rowan couldn't sleep at all. She sat by the window, going over every step of the plan in her mind, every sentence she would have to say, every reaction she would need to control. There were moments when fear took hold of her, because she knew she was about to step into the tiger's den, that one small mistake could bring everything crashing down and place not only her, but also the people helping her, in danger. But every time that fear rose up, she thought of her child, thought of the truth that child deserved, and the resolve inside her hardened again. When dawn broke over the frozen lake, Rowan stood, drew in a deep breath, and knew that today would be the day everything changed forever. The old dockyard lay silent beneath a blinding layer of white snow, the frozen lake behind it stretching all the way to the horizon, while the cold wind came in sharp gusts, whistling through the rotting wooden posts. Rowan stood in the middle of the empty yard, the recording device hidden inside her clothing already turned on, and she saw Seth approaching from a distance, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, walking with the easy stride of a man who was certain everything was still under his control. He smiled as he came closer, asking whether she had brought what he needed, and Rowan lifted the device containing the false dossier Della had prepared. But she didn't hand it over right away. Instead, she looked straight into his eyes and began guiding the conversation exactly as planned, saying that before she gave him anything, she needed to know the truth about what had happened 4 years ago. Seth frowned slightly, but his arrogance, his belief that he still held the upper hand, made him careless. Rowan kept pressing him, bringing up the name Lullaby, and she saw his face change for a brief instant. She asked him directly whether he had known everything from the beginning, whether his organization was the one truly behind her loss, and whether he had stayed silent all these years. Cornered and still believing nothing could touch him in this abandoned place, Seth finally let the mask fall. He admitted everything, his voice cold and full of excuses, saying he had no other choice, that in his world no one could stand against the organization, that he had done what had to be done in order to survive. Every word of his confession was captured in full by the recording device, and that was the exact moment the trap closed. But in that very instant, everything slipped off course. Seth, suspicious and careful by nature, hadn't come alone as he had promised. From behind the old warehouses, a group of Drago men suddenly appeared, and in a heartbeat, the quiet air of the dockyard shattered into chaos. Caleb and August's security team immediately surged out from their hidden positions, and a fierce confrontation erupted between the two sides. Shouts rang out, figures lunged at one another through the white snow, and Rowan was swept into the middle of that chaos, her heart pounding as she tried to find a place to hide. In one terrifying moment, one of Drago's men realized she was the key to this trap, and he charged straight toward her with all the savage force of a cornered man. Rowan had no time to react. She only saw that threatening figure bearing down on her, and for one split second, she thought it was all over. But then, from beside her, someone rushed forward and blocked the way in front of her. It was Caleb. He had seen the danger coming for her, and without a second of hesitation, he threw himself between her and the attacker, using his own body as a shield to protect her. Everything happened too quickly, in no more than the blink of an eye, and when Rowan finally came back to herself, she saw Caleb staggering, then collapsing onto the snow-covered ground. August's men quickly subdued the attacker and pushed back the Drago group, but Rowan no longer cared about the fight around her. She rushed to Caleb's side, dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands supporting him while the snow kept falling silently over them both. Caleb looked up at her, his face pale, but his lips still tried to form a faint smile, as if he wanted to reassure her that he was all right. Rowan called his name, her voice breaking through her tears, begging him to hold on, telling him help was coming, that he had to be okay. Caleb gently took her hand, and in a broken voice, he said he had promised he wouldn't let anyone hurt her, and he had never been a man who broke his word. Far away, through the blinding curtain of white snow, Rowan saw August striding toward them, standing tall and steady, without the slightest trace of the man who had once sat in a wheelchair, his face marked by a pain and a fury she had never seen before. August crossed through the falling snow, each step sinking deep into the white ground, and when he reached the middle of the dockyard, the remaining men of the Drago family realized that the man they had believed they had destroyed 2 years earlier was now standing solidly before them, healthy and filled with authority. That truth struck them harder than any weapon, because their entire plan had been built on the belief that August Kane was a harmless cripple. Seth stood rooted in place, his face drained white, as he understood that he had walked into a perfectly laid trap, that every word of his confession had been recorded, that the dossier he had thought was his prize was actually bait meant to lead his whole organization toward ruin. August didn't need to use violence, because he had prepared a weapon far sharper than that. As soon as the confrontation settled, and his men had restrained the entire Drago group, a flood of blue and red lights began flashing through the snow from the roads leading into the dockyard, and sirens echoed across the open space. Federal agents poured into the area, because August had quietly prepared everything in advance, had already turned over to them all the evidence of the Drago family's crimes, from the Lullaby file to countless other illegal operations he had gathered over many years. Now, with Seth's recorded confession as the final missing piece. The Drago family's criminal network had completely collapsed. Seth was led away in handcuffs by the federal agents, and when he passed Rowan, he looked back at her with eyes filled with both bitterness and something almost like belated regret. But she didn't bother answering him, because to her, he was now nothing more than a chapter that had closed in her life. The justice she had longed for throughout 4 years had finally arrived. The truth about her child had finally been brought into the light, and the guilty had finally been forced to face the law. But the price of that justice was heavier than anything she could have imagined, because when she turned back to Caleb, dropped to her knees on the frozen snow, and held him in her arms, she realized that help had come too late. Caleb looked at her, his eyes still carrying that familiar gentleness, and he whispered that she shouldn't be sad, that he didn't regret what he had done, because protecting an innocent person was always the right thing, and that was exactly what August had taught him from the very beginning. He said that seeing her find the truth and find peace again was enough for him. Rowan gripped his hand tightly, her tears falling and mingling with the white snow, begging him to stay, telling him how precious a friend he had become to her, that she couldn't bear losing one more person. Caleb only smiled, a strangely peaceful smile. Then his eyes slowly closed, and the hand holding hers gradually loosened. August came to their side and knelt beside his most loyal man, the man who had followed him since he was only a lost boy, the man August had saved and loved like a younger brother. And for the first time in her life, Rowan saw that powerful man bow his head in a silent pain too deep for words. The snow kept falling quietly over the dockyard, covering the living and the one who had just fallen, and in that breathless stillness, both August and Rowan understood that this victory had been paid for, with a price no justice could ever repay. They had defeated the Drago family, they had brought the truth into the light, but they had also lost forever a good man, a brave heart that had chosen to sacrifice itself to protect someone else until its very last breath. And Rowan knew she would carry that debt of gratitude, along with the image of Caleb's final smile, for the rest of her life. A few days later, beneath the gray, cold winter sky of Chicago, Caleb Reed's funeral was held in solemn silence. Snow covered the cemetery in white, and the people who had once stood in the shadows of the underworld now bowed their heads to say goodbye to one of the bravest hearts they had ever known. Rowan stood quietly beside August, watching them send off the man who had sacrificed his life so she could go on living, and her heart was heavy with a gratitude she knew she would never be able to repay. August stood there, his back straight and his body unmoving, his face carved with a silent grief, and when everyone else had gone, he still remained beside the grave for a very long time, as if he wanted to leave behind a quiet promise that Caleb's sacrifice would never become meaningless. In the days that followed, as the storm passed and life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, Rowan realized that she was standing at a turning point in her life. The Drago family had fallen, the danger was gone, and for the first time in so many years, she was free to choose her own path. August told her that she owed him nothing anymore, that her father would always be cared for, and Jonah would always have a steady future, no matter what she decided. He told her she was free, that she could go anywhere she wanted, begin a new life somewhere far away from all this darkness. Rowan thought about that for a long time. She could leave, could take her father and her younger brother to another city, live a quiet life and forget everything that had happened. But when she looked deep inside her own heart, she realized that what she had been searching for all along wasn't escape, but peace. And she had already found that peace, not in any place, but within herself, because the truth had set her free. For 4 years, she had lived beneath the weight of a nameless self-reproach, had believed she was to blame for the greatest loss of her life. And now, when the truth had been brought into the light, that burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She had learned that she was not at fault, that she had always been a mother full of love, and that a person's worth is never measured by their job or the possessions they own, but by their dignity, courage, and heart. She had once been a poor cleaning woman the whole world overlooked, but she had never lost her self-respect, and that was what had carried her through it all. Rowan decided to stay in this city, not as a pawn or a servant, but as a free human being who had chosen her own path. She would stay close to her father, close to Jonah, and perhaps close as well to the man who had walked with her through the most terrible storm of her life, the man with whom, between two broken souls, a deep understanding had taken root without needing to be named. Rowan Hale's story reminds us that the truth, no matter how bitter it may be, is still the only thing that can heal the wounds we silently carry inside our hearts. That no one deserves to be judged by their poverty, and that human dignity is something no power in this world can ever steal. Sometimes, kindness comes from the places we least expect, and the courage to face the truth is the beginning of every healing. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and moving stories. How do you feel about Rowan's journey? And if you were her, what choice would you have made? Please leave a few lines in the comments below so we can hear the sincere emotions from deep inside your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always be blessed with abundant health, and may every day be filled with joy and peace within your soul. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.